My name is Freya Powell. I'm an assistant professor of contemporary art practice here at Parsons and currently serving as the director of the BFA photography program. I begin by acknowledging that we are gathered speaking and learning on Lenape Hoki, hooking the ancestral lands of the Lenape peoples, which we know as New York City. We do this with humility and gratitude while recognizing the violence of forced relocation and displacement of the Lenape peoples. The BFA photography program and Aperture have had the good fortune of a really long-term relationship over 20 years now, a sort of programming partnership. And I'm thrilled to welcome you all this evening. And I'm going to be passing the mic right now to Sarah Meister, who's the executive director of Aperture Foundation. So welcome, everybody. Thank you.
Hi, thank you all for joining us this evening, and thank you so much to Parsons for hosting this program celebrating the recent release of Kinship and Community, selections from the Texas African American Photography Archive. This book presents an inspiring example of collective self-representation drawn from the Texas African American Photography Archive and highlighting the role of Black photographers who created an indelible record of post-war American life. My name is Sarah Meister, and I am Aperture's executive director. For those who might not know, Aperture is a nonprofit publisher that has been leading conversations around photography worldwide since 1952. We are proud to have recently co-published this title with Documentary Arts, a nonprofit organization based in Dallas and New York, founded by Alan Governor in 1985 to advance new perspectives on historical issues and diverse cultures. The Texas African American Photography Archive, or TAP, as we affectionately refer to it at Aperture, was established by Governor and the artist Khalida Doolin in 1995 and is one of the few independent archives funded by the National Archives. Over the last 3 decades, it has grown to include more than 60,000 images from the 1980s to the present day, providing a critical regional context for Black history and culture in the United States. The TAP archive continues to build a network and resource for mentorship among African American photographers in Texas through exhibitions, public programs, screenings, and other community engagements. The photographers featured in Kinship and Community typically operated small businesses that offered portraiture, promotional images, and event documentation, working with their communities to develop an optimistic and enduring vision. Many contributed their photographs to newspapers, magazines, and civil rights organizations, sometimes focusing on political leaders and protests. But their primary subject was the everyday expression of a vibrant and self-sufficient Black culture, an exhilarating achievement in the wider context of entrenched racial oppression. At the heart of the book is a compelling and vital new photographic essay by Raheem Fortune that takes up the archive's legacy and places it firmly in the present tense. Kinship and Community has been touched by many hands in its production, and I would like to acknowledge the hard work of our brilliant senior editor, Brendan Emser, our assistant editor, Aisha Copen-Ford, Brian Wallace, director of the Center for Photography at Woodstock, Deborah Willis, Annette Gordon-Reed, and of course, Nicole Fleetwood, Raheem Fortune, and Alan Governor. Tonight, we are honored to have Nicole Fleetwood and Raheem with us to speak about this title. Nicole, one of the book's editors, is the Paulette Goddard Professor in the Department of Media, Culture, and Communication at New York University. A MacArthur Fellow, she is a writer, curator, and art critic interested in Black art, cultural history, aesthetics, photography, and documentary studies. She is the author of Marking Time, Art in the Age of Mass Incarceration from 2020, which received the National Book Critics Circle Award in Criticism, and she curated an exhibition of the same name for MoMA PS1. She's also the guest editor of Aperture Magazine's Spring 2018 issue, Prison Nation. It's great to have you here, Nicole. Raheem Fortune is a photographer from Austin, Texas, and the Chickasaw Nation of Oklahoma. His books include Hardtack from 2024 and I Can't Stand to See You Cry from 2021, which was nominated for the Paris Photo Aperture Photobook of the Year and a winner of Les Rencontres Louis Roederer Discovery Award. He was shortlisted for the 2025 Deutsche Börse Photography Foundation Prize, and we are also very fortunate to have you here tonight. Thank you, Raheem. We will have copies of Kinship and Community available for sale after the program, as well as a few copies of each of Raheem's books. So thank you again to Parsons for hosting us. Thank you all for joining us tonight, and I'll now pass it over to our speakers.
Thank you guys for being here. It's really lovely to be back in New York and to see so many familiar and new faces. So yes, I just want to thank you guys first and foremost for making the time to come out tonight.
Yeah, it's great being here. And actually, I flew in from Houston last night, and you and Miranda flew in from Austin yesterday, right?
Yes, we did. We had to spend some time in Texas getting ready for the talk. So yeah. That's my excuse.
So I wanted to start off by saying that I think this is our fifth conversation in 2.5 years. And every time I get to talk with Raheem is a blessing. I learned something not only about photography, but just what it means to be here on this planet. So this is a joy already. We're going to start off by talking a little bit about our contributions to the project, and then just have a kind of conversation back and forth between us before we open it up to the audience. And you are watching a variety of images behind us from the catalog. I think, Sarah, I try not to correct people, but I think you misspoke when you said the archive was from 1980s until the present. It's the archive goes back to the 1870s. Yeah, so it's an incredible archive. Much of it is available online, so I highly recommend that you Google Documentary Arts Dallas. You can also find oral histories of many of the photographers, and just a lot of incredible detail about what it took to be a working Black photographer in segregated Texas over a 1.5 centuries period. And one of the things that inspired me most is the way that artists, photographers created community, and they actually created their own informal and formal school where they trained other Black photographers who were not who did not have access to other formal ways of learning about photography. In fact, one of the schools, the Till School, became the basis of the photography department at Texas Southern University, and is responsible for now training probably 5 generations of Black photographers, not only in the Houston area, but throughout the state of Texas. I teach here at NYU, and I'm largely New York based, but a couple of years ago I actually got a place in Houston where my mom and brothers live. And it's really interesting also for me to look at this archive. We have the catalog, but we also, Raheem and I are involved in compendium exhibitions that started at at the Center for Photography in Kingston, and is opening at Art and Practice in LA on April 18th. So this archive continues to grow, and it's in the life possibilities it offers us, and it kind of educating other people. But what I wanted to say is that another thing that I found incredibly inspiring looking through this archive is the way that photography is, we can talk about it as a work of art. We can talk about it as something haptic that gets printed, something archival. There's archivists here in this space. But you also see it as a social and political force and an economic force for Black working photographers in Texas who use their photographic practices to create what I talk about as media infrastructures. So a photograph of a Black owned and Black run radio station might be used to promote the radio station, but then it also get infoded in the Black press to talk about maybe local celebrities who are coming to the radio station. It becomes kind of also a tool for mentoring young people in the community who might go on to become radio broadcasters. And so you see the archive being activated in kind of multiple ways inside communities to kind of create these infrastructures. And then another thing you'll notice in the archive is the kind of everyday acts of protest and civil disobedience. When we think about the wins of the civil rights era, we think about these massive, marches of tens of thousands of people. But in fact, movements are often quiet groups. 5 people at a school board, someone protesting a segregated dining hall. And so you see throughout the archive also all these acts that are like 5 people, 10 people, 20 people, a local NAACP march and the like, that's also populating the archive. One of the things that I want to say is that when we think about the segregated South, we often think about Alabama, we think about Mississippi, we think about places like Georgia, and segregation looks and functions differently in a place like Texas, in part because Texas's history as, Texas, very conflicted history, as Mexico, in the fights between the U.S. and Mexico that went on throughout the centuries, in part, but also because of the scale of Texas. Texas is enormous; much of it is rural, and so what protest and change looks like in those areas are quite different. The history of Black freedom also plays out differently in Houston and the rest of Texas, and therefore, what we know of Juneteenth now a federal holiday. So I wanted to also just emphasize how much of that looked differently. And then the last thing I want to say is that when we think about Texas, we often don't think about it being one of the epicenters of Black life in the U.S. And many people don't realize that as of 2020, the state that has the largest population of Black people in the country is now Texas. Texas now has surpassed New York, California, and Florida. And much of that are people moving from the north to Texas, as well as West Africans actively migrating to Texas. So Texas is the state that has the most vibrant and growing Black population in contemporary U.S. I'll pass it on to Raheem.
Yes. So I guess I can give a little bit of kind of twofold context to the archive and then also my contribution to the archive. So these photographs were initially published in the 90s through the Texas A&M, which is a HBCU in Texas. They did a book called Portraits of Community. And I came across this book many years ago, and it was very formative on me as a young photographer to see, these photographs that were kind of deemed as vernacular in their creation, which, also you kind of speak to in your essay in the book, these kind of terms that are often placed onto these archives, and what separates the community photograph from kind of what we think of as like a capital A art photograph, and what are the kind of power structures that are built into that accreditation, you know, what makes this photograph less valuable to Alex Webb or, you know, and so I've always been interested in this idea. And so I'm going to try to stay on one singular kind of path of thinking with it. But the way that this archive came about was Alan Governor was a filmmaker and it still is a filmmaker, is still making films about Texas. Recently just did a film about Jasper, Texas that connects a kind of historic lynching that happened in the 80s in Jasper, Texas, back to the archive. The man, Eric, I believe his name is Eric Bird, who was the man who was lynched in Jasper. It was a massive case. There was, I think a few of the men were convicted, and he had his school photograph made by Alonzo Jordan. And so Alan does this really interesting film of connecting these things. So he's a really fascinating guy. And I think when you get into the politics of an archive like this and of just the idea of insider versus outsider, who gets to behold into these things, where do they belong, is never an easy conversation. But I do think that what he did with this project is very valuable. So while working in the 80s, he was working on these folk music recordings, and I probably go back to music often because music is a very corresponding passion of mine alongside photography, and I find the mediums to be very much connected. He was doing these folk recordings of cowboy poets, of choir singers, one woman in particular named Osceola Mays, and he was doing these recordings and already working kind of in the ephemeral landscape of the Southeast. And he finds that a publication, which, you know, is why we need fact checkers, because I've actually seen multiple institutions get thrown under the bus for this one, so I'll leave them nameless. But there was apparently a centennial of photography being published, of Texas photography, and there was not a single Black practitioner in this whole curation. And so Alan approached them, asked them why there were no Black photographers in this collection, and he says the response is quoted as, "The material simply does not exist." And so at that point, he begins scouring art, classified ads, old newspapers, directories, and finding, because when you go to Texas, it's pretty prominent, the segregation that you go into the towns. It's what I've done for my whole adult life, is drive through small Texas towns, and there's always the moment where you see the tracks and you see where the town changes. So by using these kind of roadmaps of understanding where these historical communities existed, he was able to find these photographers, and a few of them were able to have major exhibitions in their lifetimes through Alan's work. One of them in particular is Benny Joseph of Houston, who worked alongside Peacock Records, which was a soul music recording. And they also were deeply involved in the Black regional touring scene, which at the time was known as the Chitlin Circuit, which is very, very important to understanding the kind of cultural export. So Benny Joseph ends up being Don Roby, who was kind of like the Tony Soprano of Houston. He was this very interesting mixed race man who kind of treaded the color line in this very interesting way, but really brought Black music to the prominence, but was also apparently pretty quick with his pistol, as he's remembered. And if you see photos of him, and Benny Joseph did all the photographs of him. So people like Clarence Gatemouth and B.B. King and Ella Fitzgerald, he has these really stunning 4x5 negatives that he made of them, and Alan's work to make modern prints. And I mean, they're just, from style to musical instruments, there's so many historical markers in these photographs. And then the last thing I'll say, and we can kind of, go back and forth. I should speak about my pictures, I imagine. But the photographs in here are so moving. And I mean, I was really trying to work to not turn this into like an infomercial for the book where I'm like, call now. But this book really is incredible. And, I often say that when you do a project or you finish something, it's like getting a new haircut. Like you kind of always hate it at first. You look in the mirror and something's different. I felt like when I first saw the book, like it grew on me. And I think that to me is a testament as well of how well it's represented, that, it's like you want to have these and I often say this as artists and as writers and curators, we're in the business of having opinions, which can also be very annoying. So, you look at the book and you're like, oh, I would have done this. But as I have went through the book, a lot of the things that were always addressed of, the use of the ephemeral qualities of the not, because one of the things about the archive is that it is not solely silver gelatin prints. There's also a lot of object-based works, so crayon portraits, tintypes, panoramic photographs, so things that are a little bit more difficult to represent as a plate within a book. But I really loved, especially in Annette Gordon-Reed's section of the book, the way in which some of those more ephemeral photographs were included, and then the inclusion of the quotes from the photographers, because they were, working across the state. Some of them had no connection to them, but some of them are within lineage. So I think it's such a difficult balance to not overly canonize them together or not overly simplify their means of productions, because some of them, like I said, they never ran across each other. They maybe worked in solitude. And there also, when you read the oral histories, there is a wealth of photographers whose work is not represented, and some whose archives are not known where they are. And there also are a few people in the book whose archives are predominantly still within the family. So maybe TAP only owns a small fraction of their work. So one of my things that I do love so much about this book is that on the cover, is a photograph from A.B. Bell, who is one of the really stunning photographers in this collection. And the original book had a photograph from Marion Butts, who was his mentor. And so even to me, I find that these two books kind of have they are, cousins of each other, maybe. And so I contributed a series of color photographs to this book. I had published a book in 2024 titled Hardtack that was 10 years of photographing in Texas. And I was interested in the same ideas of vernacular photography, how photography has kind of become a constant reproduction of self-imaging in a way. I think so much about, that's why I was really grateful to have worked with Amani on the essay in Hardtack, was because her book South to America was so brilliant in articulating some of these ideas of cultural production, and this idea of even a city like Atlanta. It's like, what does it mean to put on an allure of Southernness, and how does photography play into how we remember places? And I find that in, particularly in this country, the South, and as well as the post-industrial Northeast, are kind of constantly under a shadow of baggage of photography and representations. And so it's not to be so much of a critical take on it, but how do you function within all of that noise? What can we learn about just kind of the rapid production of images of the American South. So rather than working in black and white, I chose to work in color to kind of underline the modern context of the photographs. And I worked in for about 1 year. So for me, this essay is about 1 year of pictures. So you get one cycle, you get the early season of certain festivals and things that happen in Texas. And then you kind of conclude the year with homecoming season, which happens in October. And then you might get a Christmas Day parade, or, if you make it out to Killeen. And, for years I photographed these same things year after year, and it's what I love to do. And, it really gets back to a concept that you speak about often, in this idea of kind of the index image. I'm curious if you would care to speak a bit about that.
I'm happy to. And then I would love for you to tell us how you started taking photographs in Texas, that your trajectory. But one of the things that I think this archive of over 60,000 images really do beautifully is kind of challenge the idea of just iconic blackness. And so much of what you see are these kind of indices of black everyday life, and what it means to create community, to gather in homes, to gather in all of these spaces where people are making moments that might seem just quotidian and everyday, but that is in fact what makes these moments so special. And the backdrop and sometimes in the foreground of all these images are also segregation. I mean, this is all taking place in a hyper-segregated state, in rural and urban communities where Black life is functioning in a way that is kind of enclosed. I mean, it's in a kind of enclosure because of the ways in which Black people do not have access to certain forms of public life. again, this functions also differently in Texas than it does in other parts of the South and other parts of the country. Your family is from Oklahoma and Texas, and like, what is it? Just can you talk to us about like how your backstory comes into play with your photographic practice, and how you told me you found your camera at a secondhand store, your first camera? Okay.
Yes, I was working at a thrift store, and I waited a couple weeks for the tag day, and I got my first camera for 99 cents, and I didn't know how.
How old were you?
I was probably about 20 years old, and I didn't know how it worked. It was an automatic camera. I'm like trying to take pictures where it's too dark, and I can't figure out like why the shutter's not closing, and it was a little bit of a mess. And I ended up working at a photo lab, and one of the patrons of the photo lab was the Magnum photographer Eli Reed, who was teaching at UT at the time. And he, if you're not familiar with his work, he was the first Black Magnum photographer, and I still say he needs the biopic. We got to get Coleman Domingo on the phone. He needs to play Eli Reed. And the lore is that John Singleton did plan to do an Eli Reed biopic before he passed, because Eli Reed did all of the unit photography on all of John Singleton's films. And so he came into the lab. He would be, probably hard shot to even remember these interactions, but they were very impactful on me. And it really showed me what photography could be, learning about his work, and ultimately coming to New York for the first time. And kind of having the ability to have a juxtaposition to where I grew up. If you grow up around the same thing, the old tractor out there and the one mailbox, it's not really particular or have anything to kind of compare it to. But it wasn't until I came to New York that I really started to realize how unique the place that I had grown up was visually. And I think also I was studying at BMCC in Lower Manhattan, and I would go to the library and I saw books like Jamel Shabazz, A Time Before Crack. I saw Bruce Davis in East 100th Street, and people like George Tyson, just a lot of classic American photography. And it really, really moved me. And I guess an important context around, the work that I do is a lot of it is around grappling with, even your own familial past or your own kind of grief, and I think that that's so embedded into photography and music again. I often say that, few of the elements within photography are light, time, and memory. You need the light to make the image, and then time changes how images are read. As you can see, something about the fashion that we might notice, especially in this wonderful Benny Joseph photograph, might not have been as spectacular at the time, but now we look back at it with admiration, even down to the kind of construction of the clothing that people are wearing. And then memory, that's it. I think memory plays deeply into how we interpret photographs. And I think it's a very fascinating thing in a modern context, because we have such an influx of images. So the way in which they function and how we read them is vastly different. And especially in a kind of recreation or a performance of the past or of memory. And I guess that's kind of where we get this idea of post-documentary, or this idea of kind of like neo-traditional. So I think that that's also another kind of parallel with music, and is this kind of every so many generations they kind of go back to the past, or we go back to as kind of aesthetic forms in this kind of this like ever revolving circle, which even was taken with my studies of the FSA. During the FSA, a lot of those photographers were trying to harken back to this idea of the 20s and the kind of American idealism within those images. So it even goes back to those times of Evans, Russell Lee. And so, I could go on and on about photographing Texas. I mean, it's the place that has really provided so much to me artistically, and, my family is there. But, one thing that I will say about photographing that I find, and we've spoken about this before, is, it's often difficult, this kind of idea of community and community photographer. I think that it's sometimes often an overused word, or it's a overly simplified word. It's kind of like if you say, like community means something different to everyone. So to have the assumption of what that is not so easily defined. And I often also kind of almost even challenge this idea of, feeling of total embrace, even within one's own family. There may be the feeling of being, the black sheep, or of never quite fitting in. And so this kind of just, there's a lot of nuance to the idea of, acceptance, and where you photograph, how it is you're embraced, how close you are to people. I find to be just an equally interesting conversation that is often approached with a lot of virtue. And so, I'm always here for the conversation of, how do you get in touch with people? What is an ethical kind of documentary practice? And, as I got into my adult years, I think it was a kind of conscious decision to go more into community. And I think that kind of ultimately came from, suffering the loss of both of my parents. And so this idea of community and extended family and representations of, kind of communion, I think took on a heightened sense, given that, my immediate family, who I love so much, had passed on, but also, imparted some of those kind of, things on me.
Thank you, Rahim. When you go into Texas, I'm curious about your first kind of time going back home and thinking, okay, I'm going back as a photographer, and what that was like for you. But I noticed that two institutions come up in your series and also your first books, and one is the Black Church. And Raheem told me he will go into these small rural Black churches and he'll start off volunteering. He might play the drums, and he kind of gets to know the elders. Often these are churches where the parishioners are elderly and the church needs some help, and you become a member, you participant. And then also the church might be rural and people might not recognize it, but you also go into these spaces where there are thousands of people at the Black Rodeo. So can you talk about like maybe those two institutions and kind of how richly symbolic they are of Black Texas?
Yes, absolutely. I'm curious if the photo will come up, because there's actually one. Yeah, so this church is in near Bryan, Texas, which it's like College Station area. All of it's, because I guess an important distinction with Texas is that it is 5 geographic regions. You have the, Gulf Coast, you have West Texas, you have Central Texas, which is the hill country, and then into Northern Texas, you have the rolling plains, which begin Oklahoma and the Great Plains of the U.S., and then up the Northeast, you have the Big Thicket, which is the swampland. And so, within the kind of cultural imagination, I often find that when people think of Texas, they think of the kind of West Texas Marlboro Man kind of cowboy aesthetic, and that to me couldn't be a further from a accurate representation of Texas. And I can definitely stop myself because I'm very into, Western history, and I can go on a whole other tangent. They'll try to move me to another department if I keep, but I'm very fascinated with it because people argue that this kind of, this idea of the Old West died with some would say barbed wire, others say the automobile, but what really changed the idea of the open plains of the Old West. And during those times, it was predominantly Black cowboys, and even within the term of cowboy was a slightly derogatory term. White men would want to be known as a cowpoke, a cowhand, foreman. So the original heritage of the cowboy in America was Black and Latino. And so a very important distinction, and it's something, a culture that is still very prominent today. And if anything has actually grown in prominence, through things like, Beyonce's Cowboy Carter and Little Nas X, for lack of better. But I guess
it's a long history that a lot of people don't recognize, right? This is not, it's a fad. I mean, this is.
And that's also one thing that I find sometimes troubling with photographing the cowboys, is to not make a kind of overly sensationalized photograph that is resting on, oh, look, wow, they exist. And I find that sometimes photography of Black cowboys kind of leans within that. And I've had multiple times, because I photographed one particular Black rodeo. There's 2 in Texas. And of course, they got beef. So, so there was also politics to that. Like, don't go over there, photograph, and then try to come back here. And so RCA, the Real Cowboys Association, which is really, really a really fascinating history there. They're out of this kind of metropolitan of Louisiana, Mississippi, Texas, because East Texas is more considered what people would be considered a part of the Black Belt, which is a very important distinction, which also has to do with kind of the cotton highways and the towns outside of Houston, all the way up to Kilgore, Longview, but also, as you said, an extremely racially oppressive place as well historically. So maybe it is that kind of, mixture of cultures and that pressure cooker that created such a, culturally rich region. But I know you asked about the churches. So what I will say about photographing at the churches was when I finished I Can't Stand to See You Cry, which was, a 6-year project that ultimately kind of photographed the end of my father's life. He passed from ALS in 2020. I had put out this book and was the next year to start photographing. And I had already been photographing in some of these places. The oldest pictures in Hardtack go back to 2016. And I was out traveling one weekend, just looking for a sign of something to photograph. I mean, my father's passing was still so heavily on my heart and so new to me. And I remember driving down Little Chestnut Street in East Austin, and I see a congregation of people lighting outside of this church, and there wasn't much else happening. So I approached them and I asked them, if I could make some photographs that day, and made a few photographs of the elders there at the church. And then that began to be about 4 years of going back to this church every weekend. And as you said, at one point becoming the drummer in the choir. And it's also an important distinction. It's a primitive Baptist church, which at one point primitive Baptists didn't even allow drums. So the fact that I'm in there doing like blast beats and like staccato, like they were gracious with me because also gospel drums are its own art form. I didn't have the cage around me and everything. It was very modest. But while photographing there, you kind of saw this evolution of the church, because when we got there, it was maybe about 6 elders. And when I say we, it's my partner, Miranda, who's also an incredible photographer and great supporter of my work, made this all possible. We would come back every weekend, and they loved having us there. They loved having some young folks there. And then the pastor changed, and Pastor Lee was just like, he was just a lot of energy, and he was kind of like, okay, picture man, like this train's moving quick. I'm gonna need you. Like, so he kind of understood that what the photographs could do within the church. But, I say all this, I'll photograph at these places for years and years, but I'm very, very careful with how I edit them because, again, to get back to something that is not just, I think to say not a surface level representation, because I often find it within photography, you're always fighting to get past the surface. And what does that mean? Does it mean more intrusion on people's lives? Does it mean getting closer? It's like, the photograph, this 2-dimensional object, there's always a complication of even photographing your own family, of how to even make them comfortable. So I spend a lot of time, and I try to be very respectful with the images that I do share. So of photographing in this place for 4 years, I've maybe only shared 4 or 5 images that I made there. And then similarly with the rodeos, I am very sparing with how I share the images, just to not make it so much of a kind of a spectacle of just the existence of it, but how do you make a photograph that kind of rises as like an aesthetic object and statement that is worthy of showing, people who are allowing you to kind of photograph their likeness and photograph into these intimate spaces. To me, that's where the kind of care and ethics come in.
Thank you. When I know you're very familiar with the TAP archive, and you've spent time with a lot of these images, and you are a student of the history of photography. You can, if you sit with Rahim, he'll start mentioning photographers from, 1930s, like rural New Hampshire or something. Like he knows all this incredible detail. So I know that you were studying these, your forebears in photography in Texas. And as you were working on this essay, which you haven't said the title of it, and it's so beautiful, and it says something about your love for music, so maybe share that with us. How were you kind of thinking about the image database and creating your own color images. And I asked that because Raheem put up on Instagram on his page, which his page is, if you just want some inspiration, go look on his just gorgeous images. But he did this pairing where he went to the archive and then kind of paired it with one of his works from this series. And it just kind of opened up the archive even more to me. So how was that working for you, kind of aesthetically, emotionally, you know, and in terms of also your legacy and thinking about the legacy of this archive?
Yes.
You know?
So the title of the essay is Between a Memory and Me, which is taken from a song title by an artist named Keith Whitley. I'm, an armchair historian of kind of American roots music. So, I've gotten lucky enough to become a professional photographer, but if I had it my way, I would probably be as good at music, but I'm still working to be, proficient in like swing and jazz improvisation. And so it's something that I'm constantly working at and really interested in. And so I think just by way of growing up in Texas and Oklahoma, I kind of gravitated towards blues and country blues and Piedmont kind of styles of music, and always interested in these kind of counter narratives, people who are lesser known in these genres. And it's something that really, really moves me. And so the title is taken from a singer named Keith Whitley, who's kind of considered to have changed modern country music. And it's funny because there's become a little bit of a kind of a joke for me. I don't drink, but it's like would be a drinking game where it's like, okay, take a drink every time somebody says memory in a country song. And there is so many examples of it. I mean, just to name a few, there's Charlie Pride. She's just an old love turned memory. There's Stoney Edwards. There's No Way to Drown a Memory. And Keith Whitley, this is just Between an Old Memory and Me. And so it's kind of an abridged version of that title. And I think for me, as I said, someone who is, because within Native culture, someone who loses both their parents, there's a term called being a war orphan, and it means that you have lost both of your parents, but you carry a kind of heightened spiritual quality because you have this both burden, but also this kind of idea of a heightened guardianship of the kind of spiritual realm. And so one of the Native elders told me that, and it really made me feel good because you go to some of these like Native territories, and it's not super uncommon for someone to have lost both their parents. And so I think also within the archive, that's where I became obsessed with that. When I moved from Oklahoma in 2007, my mother had committed suicide. And so I was grappling with this as a middle schooler. And I think that so much of that feeling and that pain and lack of understanding, I was kind of taken right out of Oklahoma and placed back into Texas with my father. My parents were divorced at the time. So I was now living in this place where no one besides my younger sister and I had any context of the place where I grew up. And, I kind of go back to like the Zora Hurston quote where she says, a story is a terrible thing to keep inside of you. And I feel very similar to that. I would go onto online archives and I would kind of obsessively, it kind of reminds me a little bit of like the Ramel Ross Nickel Boys, where the man is there and he's kind of observing every single detail about this place that he had experienced. And so I would search all of these keywords, trying to just understand this place that where I grew up. And so for me, I think that's where photography exists, is kind of need to see something. And, if it's in other people's photographs or if it's in the things that I photograph, there's this kind of, and I think it is like an intrinsically human thing to kind of need this like, affirmation. And I think that's why these photographs in the archive resonate so much, even within a modern context, because even if it's an oral storytelling tradition, like, just for centuries, people have shared these stories. And I often think of kind of cultural history and lineage. I've heard it described as like a scaffolding that's, kind of guards you a bit through life, keeps you from getting hit on the head by something because you kind of have a bit of a grounded and a rootedness in where you're from. And so, that's what keeps me excited to keep putting film in a camera, to keep going to these places. And it's something that I think I'll always do.
Are you able to say a little bit more about that kind of pairing that you were doing when you were I mean, what you said was very moving.
The question.
Yeah.
So when I was preparing for this essay, I feel very beholden to the photographers in this essay to really, being blessed and honored to carry forth this history, to know a lot about their work and to really study deeply the images that they made. So in preparation for this talk, I was looking at the Kinship and Community and reading the essays in there. And there was a lot of parallels that I was beginning to see to photographs that I had made. And I think this is kind of an important thing to say, that, there's an own ethics of going out and making photographs of people and saying, look, community. I always have this joke where I say, you're going to walk up to a guy in the street and say, hey, can I take your photo? I'm making a book about Texas. And he goes, just moved here from St. Louis. Sorry, can't help you. There is, and I even think about, Ramel Ross. He had an exhibition with William Christenberry, and he has this quote where he says, kind of talking about this idea of the Southern photography starter pack, the things you have to have, if you're going to do a book about the South, you got to have some porches, and you're going to have some clotheslines, and how do you avoid these kind of stereotypes and these tropes? And so I wanted to be very careful with how I place this idea of community onto people in a modern context. And so that's why I chose to focus on the kind of ecosystem of Black community in Texas, because I find that it is something that is a lot less centralized than maybe when these photographs were taken. And I think that has also had political implications. There being less things that unify people gives a less kind of political agency, because we're a bit less connected in our daily lives, where historically when neighborhoods were a little more tight knit, people can talk about it, and it's kind of the old thing of you do something bad in the neighborhood, the word makes it home before you do, kind of thing. And there's a lack of that nowadays. And so what I find is that there's this kind of, between the churches, the academic institutions, as well as the kind of hometown parades and pageants that happen, there is a bit of an ecosystem of year after year, the things that happen, the places that people gather. And so I would go out and I would photograph these things, and it's a part of my methodology for making the book Hardtack. And so I just continued with this book. But when I was going through the book, I saw these parallel images of the Freemasons in the parades, of the young women in the pageant sashes, of, cowboys and people who were, kind of equestrians. And so I began to pair some of the images, and it was really a light bulb moment for me that really kind of contextualized these photographs into making them feel like a kind of completed piece. And so, I'm glad that you enjoyed that.
It's beautiful. So we have time for questions, and I hear the acoustics in this room are pretty amazing. So I think, if you're brave enough, you can stand up and project, raise your hand. If you do need a mic, we can ask somebody to start. Maybe Alex, would you be willing to maybe take my mic? Okay.
Hello, my name is Chinenya. My question is, especially with photographing community, how do you reconcile with your images going into a market or ecosystem that is based on capital and the moving of funds? And I think it's really hard as an artist to maybe balance those two realities. So that's my question.
Yes, I mean, that conversation to me is always going to be a difficult one but it's often something that I would say, especially in the context of photography, more kind of at a larger terms, is that same pressure placed on, the kind of titans of the genre, to say, oh, you should not put your images on the market. To me seems like asking of, a photographer to function outside of the kind of historical model of how does a photographer, eke out a living. And I mean, Calvin Littlejohn in the book, he says, I often took the assignments because I was the only person, willing to starve for it. And, if you want to see the books, they're not, it's not landing in the green. So to be expected to not make your images, commercially available just for like kind of a means of virtue, I find is sometimes an unfair expectation that is not placed on our white counterparts in the same kind of more broad way. And I guess another thing that I'll say is that, the people who I photograph are proud to be represented in the photographs. There's no kind of gotchas or trying to peek behind a veil, these kind of customs that are standard in the kind of documentary canon of kind of this idea of ugly truths and of, the raw image. And so my images are not functioning within that way. And so I don't feel, it's like at the end of the day, you're the person who has to sleep with that. And, your feelings towards that can ultimately, evolve. But what I will say is that I mostly deal with, I don't really sell to private collectors. It's mostly kind of an academic and institutional thing. And then often, if there is terms worked out with the collaborator, there are people who also, they do gain financially from the print sales as well. People who were kind of collaborators within that. But, I find that to just be one of the fundamental kind of complications of photography is that we are dealing with the likenesses of people, kind of reality as it happens. But, it's, you don't really get into the type of photography I do to become rich. It's a thing that you just kind of try to break even and have enough to load up another roll of film, put another gallon of gas in the car. And, it's a bit more connected with the people that I live in Texas, it's not this crazy kind of like pulled out thing where it's like, all right, I've got like this ultimate 6-week road trip through Texas to hit all the like rare spots. It's way slower than that,
Thank you for that question. I think when you say capital, what I would like to expand that to think about transactional, like so that how are we not being transactional? Because how many of you are working photographers in the room? I'm just curious, right? And it's a nice amount of people, but I'm a historian and a critic. I don't make photographs, but I write and I interview people, and I think sometimes the general public don't realize that most photographers are losing money to take a picture. They're not, they don't take a picture. They're not, they're trying to eke together money to buy a roll of film because they love what they're doing. And so I think the question is not so much about the monetizing of the image, but maybe the conditions under which the image are produced and a kind of recognition of, especially when we're talking about photographs of living people, right? The kind of engagement and recognition of people's full humanity and what does it mean to consent to those images. But I do think we really, in 2026, need to take very seriously the living conditions of photographers and artists in general, because we do talk kind of abstractly about like how do you negotiate making money around most working artists are barely getting by, and we shouldn't be okay with that. I just want to say that about the work of art itself.
Yeah, but an absolutely incredible question and a revolving answer in conversation. There's also the ability for one person to take issue with what you're doing and that to be, a thing. But one anecdote I can say from it, there's a photograph. It wasn't included in Hardtack, but it was absolutely one of my favorite photographs. And it's of a young woman named Ashley Watts, and she's the Stampede Queen at the Longview Rodeo. And I made this portrait of her in the V&A Museum. And I wasn't in contact with her, and the V&A Museum did a video about my work, and they really highlighted that photo of her. And then there was this kind of moment of her getting to connect, and this, idea of this immense pride that she had to be represented and to be able to be, more or less the face of this history in this way. And when you think about these, like some of these kids and their like extracurriculars, like that is like honestly a big goal for them, that they're like, they did it. And so I always make the joke of like this idea of like, and I'll stop myself because I could go on about it, but I love this conversation. But this idea that, you're not completely existing outside of the world that you're photographing. And I often say that when I'm out making these pictures, it would be the same way of like if I had on my best outfit on my best day and I walked down the street and then a photographer was there and he just happened to hit the perfect angle. Like I would be pretty hyped about that too. And that's more how I think about the interaction. It's like you were like an ROTC kid, or sometimes even you'll be photographing young people who are kind of begrudging to the things that they're doing. Like they're not happy to be in the marching band. And then maybe you photographing it makes them kind of like be like, well, damn, maybe this is kind of fly. And that's kind of where I like the interaction to come. But most of the time, like, you know, I make way more bad photos than I do good ones. And it's a kind of constant like banging your head against a wall. So if you're crazy enough to do it, and, you know, I think that, you know, you're putting in some kind of rigor to it as well. And also, how I said, how I disseminate the images. I won't go out and make photographs and then kind of right away put them on social media. They kind of live for a long time and are considered of why we're using that one. And but yeah.
Hi, my name's Maisie. It feels like navigation is a big part of your work in the way that you're moving through space and sort of identifying these demarcations of people and their spaces. And I'm curious if you had a sort of process when entering the archive that maybe reflected that at all, and how are you looking at the images? And you also said you always have this impulse to return to Texas. And I'm curious if you now have this impulse to return to the archive at all after this.
Yes, I mean, I'm not sure. So within the actual editing of the archive, I wasn't necessarily involved in the images that were picked. I more so contributed the photographic essay. So I'm not sure if you care to...
The color photos. Were you asking about color photos?
Yeah, so, you know, it was tough because with the color photographs, as I said, it was 1 year of making pictures, which is for me normally a pretty short amount of time. You know, you might get a few good ones in a year, and so I had to also kind of work in that terms of being able to do something that was, you know, could fit within that time span. But I mean, there's so much that you can continue to learn from these photographs, and as well as Alan's films. You know, he did a film on black rodeos in like 92 after first photographing the same rodeo on, like, I think it's called the Circle R Ranch in 89. And so this was much before my time. And so a lot of these things that I'm interested in, Alan has been doing for, you know, decades. And so it's been really great to connect with him. And it also gives me some kind of roadmaps and ideas around my own practice. And so, yeah, I mean, I no kid you, I have the book in my tote bag. Like I brought it on the train because it's just, I couldn't stop looking at it. So yeah, definitely I'm excited for you guys to be able to dive in. And there is a very different representation of the images in this book versus the original 1990s book that came out. And I really loved these incredible hand tinted photographs that are in here. There's a few from Alonzo Jordan and a few from Curtis Humphrey that are just, you know, just artistic marvels. So there's definitely a lot to, you know, continue to return to. But I would say when it comes to making photographs, it's a lot less pre-visualized for me sometimes, especially within this project. I worked on handheld 35mm cameras, where previously I had worked on large format and 6x7 cameras. And so it allowed me to kind of just be, you know, a little bit more nimble, and also not trying to, if you look at the pictures in Hardtack, I'm very intentionally trying to kind of make things look removed from time, where in these photographs, I don't mind if you see the, like, you know, Toyota Camry and somebody on their iPhone. Those things are fine, where previously in Hardtack, those were like, you know, non-starters. I always wanted the photographs to really feel like they could have been made in any decade, so that we kind of had this, you could kind of feel how close we were to some of these histories. But yeah, I know we had a couple questions over here. I don't want to lose you guys.
Great. Great to meet you and see your work. I'm kind of like a two-part question. What do the community and the people of Texas think of, like, Juneteenth? Like me, I grew up in New York. You know, Juneteenth is one of these holidays that, you know, it's great. But I wonder what the people on the ground really think of it. And in the second part, Texas is known for also having these tough prisons, right? that affects, African Americans. So tell me about those two things in Texas, if you can.
Yes, no, that really, really great question. So Juneteenth, it's funny you say that because I feel like when Juneteenth became a national holiday and like Walmart did the plates and all that stuff, it was like a little bit of like the memification of Juneteenth, happened, which was really sad. For me, because I feel like some people didn't understand how important it was as a holiday in the South. And so just for context, in Texas, in June, it is extremely hot. So afternoon, after like literally like, 12 o'clock rolls around, you got to either be in some shade, a front yard, near a swimming pool, on the beach, which is very befitting that that Juneteenth started in Galveston, which is a beach town. And I'm like, maybe I'll spend my Juneteenth there next, because you need to be near some water. It's a very, very hot day. But I've also heard stories that historically African Americans did not celebrate the 4th of July. It was Juneteenth was the delineation of even just segregated customs. And so I'm trying to remember, I was just reading about this. I think it was, it's in the book. Annette Gordon Reed writes about not having memories of July 4th, but having memories of Juneteenth. And also in Texas, as you get into, because often as it happens around the country, the first places to gentrify are historic Black neighborhoods. People come up and they buy up a lot of land. And so that's happened very rapidly in Texas. And so, East Austin or, some of like Third Ward or Fourth Ward Houston have completely changed. And even to the point to where in Austin, they considered moving the parade because that's no longer where folks live, even though it is the historical, what was known as 6 square miles of Black business district, which was 12th and Chicon was considered like Little Harlem. And there was all these clubs and all of that has now been rapidly gentrified. And so people are kind of having to come from out of town now to come back to the old neighborhood. And so that's a tough thing. But what I will say is on Juneteenth or at the Black rodeos, and I'm sure there are customs here in New York as well, that similarly, where there is a heightened sense of communion on these days, there's a certain kind of like feeling when you are walking at the parade and you see someone and you say, Happy Juneteenth, brother. That's a little different than just on every other day where people are a little bit more guarded. So that's the kind of sentiment with Juneteenth in Texas, but it also is something that has become to attract a lot of corporate interest. So now you come and it's like, oh, the Juneteenth parade sponsored by, or there was one year where there was a Juneteenth parade without one active Black marching band in Austin. And it just goes to further show you the kind of disenfranchisement and cultural erasure. And then around the prison, system in Texas, completely oppressive places like Sugar Land, Texas, which had, just really, oppressive kind of conjugal work programs. Danny Lyon did a lot of incredible work around the Texas prisons in the maybe 80s and 70s. But then also an archive that I'm really interested in is for decades and decades, they had a prison rodeo that was take place at Huntsville. And there was actually a music scholar who worked at that prison, and he helped to produce a series of music records out from bands incarcerated. So there was country soul bands that cut these records out of Huntsville prison, and they would perform at the rodeo. So they kind of became like local celebrities. And that actually stopped happening because less and less people who were being incarcerated were from rural areas. And so it became a little bit of a liability just to like allow who would just be willing to get on a bull to just do it. It's like, we need people who got some training in this. But it completely is a massive, kind of blemish on Texas. And there are so many things. I don't want to sit here and be overly glorifying Texas. There's a very complicated place, very, politically split. But there also is so many incredible people that make it, the kind of cultural phenomenon that it is. But yeah, it's definitely, a lot of hard times, and it's not an easy place to do many things. Even there's something about the arts that are really difficult to kind of maneuver in Texas. But, I think that it has gotten better, and there's also a generation of young artists now coming out of Texas, and, but like all things with art or anything, it's this kind of constantly revolving wheel where things come in and out of trend. And so I try to dance, as, one of my elders said, they said, dance between the raindrops, because the ones who get hit, they, and so that's kind of my approach as well, is, trying to not, overly try to keep up with what's going on. I have like my way of working, and, I try to just not tune out the noise a little bit. I know
I think we have time for one more question.
So I know Jason and this person here, if you want to both ask the question, then we can just answer both.
Just a quick question. I don't know who made the edit of the archival pictures, but I was wondering how you did that and what you were thinking about.
That was a massive collaboration between Aperture, the team at Aperture, Brian Wallace, myself, and then Alan Governor, who brought the archive together. And so Brian and I co-edited through Aperture, and we actually came up with a kind of series of themes that we wanted to work through that spoke to the broader archive, but also weren't completely reproductive of other publications, because there's been some regional publications coming from the book, and one of those was this idea for me that the kind of Black media infrastructure that I think you see with like kind of local celebrity culture, with the radio stations, with and just thinking about kinship and community in more expansive ways. Like, I love your critique of how people kind of approach community when they think about photography, and you see community like actively being not only negotiated but built through the use of photography in and the invisibility of certain structures of apartheid, which is what people were living through, are also shaping forces of those images. So it was a combination of things. It was kind of working with images that spoke to the archive, but weren't also the ones that have been reproduced so often. Mm-hmm. Anything that Aperture wants to add to that? Because Aperture is involved in, okay.
Hi, my name is Vince. Thank you for this conversation. Actually, I was going to ask about about community, and something that you said that stuck with me was around how something about like photographs of community can feel superficial, and like the tension of like, going deeper and being more vulnerable and intimate with your subjects. How do you navigate that? Like, what is your process for building that trust with community, maintaining those relationships, and especially like going into new places, new spaces where you're not familiar with people or the culture? How do you, what was your process to navigate that?
I'm sorry.
Yeah, so, it's definitely a kind of a multi-pronged answer and idea. It's been a crazy journey within photography, because it's really what I've done most, of my adult life has been photography. Even from moving here, in my kind of early 20s. And, I remember a funny story of that was, I actually applied to and had an interview to work at B&H one day, which in itself was a crazy experience. And after leaving, I see who's a fixture there. I see Louis Mendez is sitting outside of B&H, and I go, "Hey, Louis, I just applied at B&H. I just had an interview, man." And he goes, "I hope you don't get the job." And I'm like, "What?" And he was like, "Come here for a second." He was like, "Look at all these people." He's like, "Every one of these people is walking around with your money in their pocket. Now you just got to figure out how to get it back. And if you don't know, copy my style." So that night I went out and tried to sell Polaroids, and I sold maybe half of one. I took an underexposed picture and they gave me half of what I was asking for. So And then, you know, I have times where one of my first things I was photographing in the East Coast was the Shinnecock powwow. And I remember, you know, seeing Jamel Shabazz out there and obviously knowing who he is and being a big fan of his work, but, you know, playing it cool and kind of having this true, like, Jamel, Raheem, nice to meet you, man. And, you know, so it's like all these people are kind of, you know, it kind of gets back to what Louis said, the whole idea of like, and if you can't find my style, you know, if you can't find your own style, you know, copy mine. And I think that there's a lot of that with like this mentorship, you know, idea. And if you've ever seen videos of Jamel while he's photographing, while he's working, he's kind of larger than life. You know, I often say that you can't go out and photograph people if you're in like a sour mood, like, you know, because that comes across. And, you know, you have to, you know, or another quote that I love is Joel Meyerowitz, where he says like photography starts with enjoying going on the walk. You know, you can't be this ball of tension where you're like, where's the next masterpiece? You know, and sometimes that can be difficult when you're spending your money and you're going on these trips, but you have to form a thing where you're just okay with just being there. And it's really become a thing where I really love going to these places where I photograph. And, you know, so sometimes there's things where it's a chance encounter and you photograph someone, you get a really great picture of them. That is often more difficult because there is this layer of tension between yourself and them. And then maybe it's a time where you return a second year, or maybe it's just about hanging out for long enough to kind of, there is no real like hack to it. And I think that's what is, I always say is equally rewarding and painful, is that you never know what your next picture is going to be. And so I always tell students, I'm like, you know, you're doing the right thing when you're like out to make a project and it's like golden hour and you're inside a Burger King parking lot and you're just like, man, what do I take a picture of? Because that really is such a big part of it. It's just the unknowing. And then, you know, then you'll maybe have a day where something spectacular happens, and it's just about being outside and being, you know, ready and interested. But, you know, a lot of the people that I photograph, we have a lot of shared interest. And, you know, also, you know, Joseph Rodriguez is, you know, I wouldn't necessarily call him a mentor, but definitely a role model of mine. And he's big on saying, you know, we have, you know, 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason, to really be about listening and, you know, knowing how to ask people questions. And then there's, you know, so many times that I would get history from people that you couldn't even find online. You know, you would try to go and find something about like, you know, an institution or a person from the community. But, you know, like I said, and then there's also the element of social cues, of understanding social cues, of understanding when it's appropriate to take a photo, when it's not. And I mean, that's no different anywhere. You know, that's something that I'm really fascinated with. You know, even being someone who's not from New York, to moving to New York. My partner's from New York and her family is all from East New York, Brooklyn, you know, very Jamaican family, a very different context to where I grew up. So to learn the cues of like getting onto the packed B83 and knowing who to not to rub against, who not to try to say, give, you know, like there's a whole like ecosystem of kind of undercurrent social cues that are understood. It's like when, you know, someone reaches out for the pound and you've got the handshake, you know, we're kind of constantly awkward in our own existence. And so, you know, I embrace it. You know, I'm always skeptical of anyone who's a little too slick, a little too smooth. I'm always putting my foot in my mouth and, you know, losing sleep over something dumb I said, or, you know, but, you know, it keeps me excited. And, you know, I also just really want to say thank you so much to Aperture, to Nicole, for all of you guys. And yeah, for us, to me, this is community. So give yourselves a round of applause.